guests. Shafeeq Ghabra here with me in the studio. There's some pretty serious political mudslinging going on right now. What's happening in the UK in terms of the revelations of this alleged report, details of which we still have to see? One wonders what that relationship can be, considering Theresa May had just visited Saudi Arabia a few months ago, and how damaging it could be if countries start really putting pressure on Saudi and on European Union countries to say, got to do something about Saudi Arabia now.
I think this is the wrong focus. No one, 15, 16 years after the September 11 attacks, among the states can be exactly accused of supporting terrorism. To narrow it down, the kind of terrorism we see, such as ISIS and ISIL, is predominantly a result of very complex closed systems, socioeconomic conditions, different wars that have taken place in this region, lack of democracy, lack of debate, lack of actual education that educates for diversity. So as a result, what I see is that cutting the funding or whatever funding exists is not going to be the solution, because already a lot has been done in that direction between September 11 and today.
And if that's the case, that you can't cut the funding, or the funding shouldn't be cut, however these governments spin that line, one has to, in this particular case, we'll look at Qatar as well, but let's start with Saudi. They say they don't support terrorism. They say these are all lies. Is it a case that at government level they are fighting terrorism and that they've turned a blind eye, or they're not interested, or they haven't had the capability to deal with the grassroots support that these groups have, and that the society at ground level are supporting groups like ISIL, also known as Daesh, and it's hard to control that?
You see, policies of exclusion, policies that end up bringing about no hope in terms of equality, justice, decent life. People would want to have peace, ways by which people can flourish and live, have a decent treatment and a decent relationship with their government across the region is a problem. It's not a Saudi problem alone. No. It's an Arab problem. It's all over the place. However, you cannot accuse Qatar. Therefore, you cannot accuse Saudi Arabia. You cannot accuse anybody today of funding, but what you can do is that work on the socio-economic, political, cultural conditions of lack of hope, that people call for justice. Look at 2/11, the 2/11 revolutions. That was the most peaceful year in Arab modern history, because people had hope of a non-violent transition towards democracy. Look what happened after 2/11, with the coup in Egypt, with the counter-revolution in the region, with all the attack on democratic thinking, putting them in jail, cutting them all across, putting people all over the place into exile. That produced again ISIS and ISIL and violence and terrorism and hate and anger from a very close situation.
There are those in Saudi Arabia that don't want this to be expanded. They don't want their children to follow these terror groups as such. Yet there is the accusation, again made by the international community sometimes, that Saudi Arabia is fighting a de facto fight against Shia regimes, and by supporting groups like ISIL, who don't like the minority Shia group, they are perpetuating that violence.
See, it's a phenomenon.
It's an accusation, isn't it? It's tit for tat.
What I want to say, it's a phenomenon. Many Jordanians are part of this. If you look at the numbers, many Saudis, Tunisians, many Iraqis, they're the ones involved mostly. So when you really look deeply into it, it's a phenomena that results from injustice. As a result, some people in that context of injustice decide to go through what they see as an armed approach to their injustice, a violent approach to their injustice. And they look for an ideology. And they find, since they live in a system in the region that education has not been in the best of, or democracy, or pluralism, so they borrow from, as far as they go in religion, the most extreme they find in religion, the most extreme phrase, and they use it. So what I want to say This phenomena is the closest to the Jacobians of the French Revolution. It is the closest to the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia. It's a brand of Marxism, Khmer Rouge. It's a brand of French nationalism. And it's a result of injustice and closed political systems. The only way to deal with it is to deal with these issues in this region. Okay. And we may have another 15 years of terrorism and violence. So we need to open up the space, the political space, the cultural space.
And we'll comment as such from Shafeeq, because, you know, this whole train of thought of Wahhabism and Salafist thought isn't just a thought, it is actually taught in religious schools. It is part of the social structure, even preachers preaching it in Saudi Arabia as well. And that has a huge influence. It's very different to any other Muslim country in that way, in that it is very, very conservative in terms of the way it implements and gets the message across.
But that conservatism was there in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. It didn't create this kind of violence. So what I want to say...
What's changed then? Very quickly,
what changed is that the Arab world in particular is going through a big transformation. The Iranian Revolution came in 1979 and politicized Islam at a huge level. So all this politicization of religion came into the political field. And when the political field is blocked, cannot express itself, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of writing, freedom of even dressing and travel and life. And so there's too much frustration, and then comes poverty and injustice, corruption and lack of accountable government. With all of this, what do you have? You have a nuclear explosion. This is the dilemma today of the Arab world. It will continue to be so as long as we don't deal with these major questions. It's not a Saudi problem only. Saudi Arabia is part of this problem, but it is a larger Arab dilemma.
Indeed, and it's a dilemma that we will continue to revisit. We've only just touched, you might say, the peak of this particular mountain. For all of my guests, Shafeeq Ghabra with me here in the studio, Simon Mabon in Lancaster, and Marwan Kabalan also in Doha. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time on this edition of Inside Story.